the name Lance isn't very common. But in the Middle Ages, they were called Lancelot. They were. All right, folks, that's it. Folks, that's it.
Really cool.
Two places. And right.
Yeah.
The stories, the myths. Right. I can see you in two places.
Okay, can you hear me, Richard?
Yes, I can hear you.
All right, SOS to Richard. Yeah, okay, so it's working. If you have any questions for me regarding that whole deal, feel free. Yeah. But I mean, hello, everybody. Today on the podcast, we have Sir Richard Rohlin, the Germanic philologist.
Yep.
Yeah, and you said I think you had told people that might be thought of just as a medievalist, like that.
Yeah,
might be
essentially, I'm sort of I was trained as a Germanic philologist. My work lately has been sort of more broadly medieval, particularly focused on medieval Christianity and liturgy, and the way that affects storytelling, you could say. So that's kind of what I've been doing more of lately. I sort of fell into that accidentally because I saw that there was a need for someone to be talking about these things. But my initial sort of first love is all about vowel changes in misty forests. So.
Wow. Yeah. When I had ran into you after, it was somewhere in the middle of getting into Lord of Spirits. It might have been like right as I found Andrew, Father Andrew. I had heard your voice that's how I remember is I heard your voice immediately after talking with him and just anyone who knows things about medieval literature, I'm game now. That's sort of I don't know if the period itself is more rich for digging into, but it seems like it's more rich for digging into than anything that I've known. And I think that might just be because I don't know about it.
Well,
might be one.
Yeah, I mean, it definitely has a sort of a sense of magic about it, right? That we don't necessarily. That we don't really see or remember or really experience about more recent history, and that's for a few different reasons. But it's also because the Middle Ages is kind of the source of you could say together with antiquity and particularly Greco-Roman culture. It's sort of the source of all of our stories, right? It's a reason when we do fantasy, we usually end up needing to situate it in the Middle Ages. People will do steampunk fantasy or fantasy set in the Victorian times or something like that. But we all sort of know that's let's say a concession. We're oh, well, isn't this fun and interesting? But as a normal baseline, fantasy happens in the Middle Ages, and I think there's a reason for that.
Yes. It's. Do you think it's where we get, how many of our stories sort of crystallized in the Middle Ages? It's I don't know, culturally or on a did they become more luminous or numinous or something like that during those times?
if I think what you probably mean by our stories would be like our cultural stories, right?
Yeah.
The stories, the myths, whatever you want to call them, that
What we
give
sort of know.
yeah, that give sort of shape and meaning to the Western, like the Western experience or the experience of Western civilization. I would say for the most part, those things did crystallize, those things did maybe grew into their fullness, would be a nice way to say it, during the Middle Ages. There are some newer stories which they're not totally absent from the medieval world as a whole, because I mean, when we talk about the Middle Ages, we're really talking, I mean, that's really a stupid name for 1,000+ year period, that you could say begins with, some people like to begin with the fall of Rome in the West. I think really you can, if you want to put, okay, so this would be my personal, this is how I would try to date it. I would begin the period at the founding of Constantinople, because this is really when Constantinople is the construction of the first Christian city. There are other cities like Rome where Constantine didn't bulldoze all the pagan temples in Rome, but what he did is to actually build like a ring of churches around Rome. And so anybody entering Rome, no matter which direction you're entering Rome from, you're passing through these enormous and beautiful churches. So, but with what he did with Byzantium was to actually level the entire city to the ground and then build a new city. And it was the first city built in the ancient world without a pagan temple in it. So it was built around the church from day one. So to me, that's actually really the beginning of the medieval period, if you want to call it that. And then I would extend that period to somewhere probably later than a lot of people would like to. I would extend that to somewhere like right around let's say the fall of Constantinople. So you could basically say the history of Constantinople is the history of the Middle Ages. And maybe that sounds like a super, like Eastern Orthodox thing to say or something like that, but it's not, because I have like I mean, I do love Byzantine culture. I think it's very interesting and very beautiful, but it's just because the whole medieval project is kind of like summed up in Constantinople. So when it declines and when it falls, there is a loss of something. Like there really is a transition. We really do move into let's say kind of a modern period, but also it gives birth to something else. And so I don't know, this is an idea that I've been thinking about a lot, and this might be more than you wanted to get into today, but to go off script for a second, one of the questions that I've heard a few people say, especially responding to the universal history videos that Jonathan Pageau and I have been doing, is to say, well, it's fine to talk about the medieval project or the medieval model or all this stuff, but well, don't you know that really did come to an end, And I think that actually in some respects you can think of the whole Middle Ages as being sort of a long, 1,000-year long gestation period for something else that was being birthed. Maybe two some things that were being birthed, and one is sort of Western civilization as we know it today, which is basically it's a secularized version of that project. It's an attempt to have those morals and those values that we developed over that time, but to have them without putting the church at the center. And then also let's say the Orthodox Church today, right? Like one of the reasons that Byzantium or Constantinople, one of the reasons the empire could pass is because it has sort of given all the things to the church that the church needed. And so what you have then is, even in the midst of, terrible oppression by the Turks and communism and all this other stuff, like the last 600 years have been pretty rough. as far as the history of the Eastern Orthodox Church is concerned. But we've been able to retain this really beautiful, treasure of learning, of spirituality, of all these things under some pretty difficult circumstances. And the more that I learn about that, the more I am amazed by it. And I don't think that we would have been able to retain that without this beautiful patrimony that was sort of handed to us, and that actually, in a certain way, you could say was part of the death of the old empire. If you have an empire where you have more monks than soldiers, you're probably not going to defend yourself very well against enemies from outside. But you have a spiritual heart that will probably outlast any particular historical empire. So I think that you could look at the Middle Ages as being sort of like this long gestation period, and because of that, all of our cultural stories and our points of reference and all these things that really shape the world around us, shape our experience of the world, and give meaning to us. Those things, for good and for ill, I think we can sort of dig back and find them there. So it's kind of a long answer, but
that is awesome. Yeah, that is awesome. It makes me like, wonder more. So just like what an impact these stories have on our like spiritual life, I guess. And you don't realize until you it's like, as soon as I crack open a book that's like you remember how wonderful it is that they're like around, and that you can like crack it open anytime and be like reinvigorated with culture, I guess.
Yeah.
Or
C.S. Lewis calls that the being able to see with other eyes than your own, and that this does two things for us. One is that it fulfills a deep-seated human need to sort of like to go beyond the limitations of our own experience, but then that it also allows a broadening of our perspective, which is really necessary to enter, you could say, to have empathy would be one way to phrase that, but really just to be human, to enter into loving relationships with the world around us, really does require this broadening of the perspective. And the problem with reading a modern book, all of this is in an essay by C.S. Lewis called On the Reading of Old Books, which is actually part of his introduction to a translation of On the Incarnation by Saint Athanasius the Great.
Yes, right.
Yeah. But the essay is quite good. He talks about why would you bother to read an old book about theology when there's so many new books being written? You could say the same thing. Why would you bother to read an old novel? Why would you bother to read an old work of literature, poetry? Why would you read Chaucer? Why would you read Beowulf? Right? When there's so much new content being put out. And what he says is, the problem with new literature is that it has all the same shortcomings that you do as far as your perspective and the way that you view the world goes, right? That you can't break out of the, without some outside help, right? You're in Plato's cave, like you can't break out of the culture that you live in. And another time and another culture had its own problems, but they also had answers to a lot of your problems. And we can't use a time machine to go into the future and find out what's the literature of the future like, which might, have some good insights for us. But we do have books from the past, this preservation, which is only probably about 5% of what was written, in the Middle Ages and in antiquity. Probably only about 5% of it survives. But it's the most of the stuff that survives, not all. I mean, there are some real duds in medieval literature, but most of the stuff that survives, survived because somebody thought it was worth keeping, it was worth copying, it was worth saving.
Yeah.
Right. So there's a kind of a selection process that has happened as a result of that, tradition.
Okay.
Yeah. So as a result, like not everything that is old is good, but there's a much higher ratio, you could say, of good of stuff that's good and worthwhile to read among what survives from the olden days as opposed to what we have now.
That makes a lot of sense. You could go more into that if you wanted. So that was
Yeah. I mean, the one way to say this would be, in the Middle Ages, if people wrote something down, it was because they believed it was important. So you can get into the idea, and I know this is one of the things you want to talk about, was the idea of the medieval book, the idea of the medieval tale, right? Why does, some stuff get written down, other stuff doesn't, right? So in the Middle Ages, if somebody wrote something down, there's an economic cost associated with that. So most writing, I would say almost all writing done in Western Europe is done on parchment or on vellum, which comes from a dead animal. Not just any dead animal. You can't just use like an old sick cow that was going to be useless anyway and be like, well, we may as well make paper out of him. That's because you really got to use a young animal, because the skin's got to be flexible and workable and everything to basically stretch and scrape and stretch and scrape and stretch and scrape, and then finally cut it down and stretch it again and scrape it again, like to get this piece of animal hide to a place where it's something you could actually use as a page in a book. And we can't, I mean, the only way to understand this is to actually go and do it yourself. And if somebody has the time and the space and neighbors who don't mind stinking animal hides in their backyard, I really encourage you to like go out and like go down to the local butcher or whatever and get a piece of hide and try to make one page. Like, you can look up how to do this on the internet. There are videos on YouTube. There are a lot of people who are into this. Try to make one page and just see how much work that is. And then so take the tremendous amount of time into account. And by the way, if you're like an apprentice scribe, let's say like you're a young monk at a monastery and you want to work in the scriptorium, your job for the first few years of your apprenticeship, or your first few years of your novitiate or whatever, is you don't get to write. You don't get to learn how to write. You have to learn first how the paper is made. You got to learn how quills, how pens are made, how ink is made, right? And you had to learn to do all of those things before they would even let you start, copying the alphabet. So if you're a literate person, if you're a man of letters, so to speak, you're significantly invested in the whole process, right? So you've got a tremendous amount of time that goes into this, but keep in mind that it's a young animal that has to be killed. So there's also a huge, in economic terms, we would call it, say, like lost economic opportunity, right? If I kill a young sheep or I kill a young calf to make a few pieces of paper out of their skin, then that's a cow or a sheep that I can't raise, I can't eat them later, I can't breed them later. They can't, sorry, there's a little background noise. Kids are sort of getting up and getting out of the house and stuff. So I can't kill that sheep, I can't make cheese with its milk, I can't breed it, I can't sell it, etc. Like, the only thing that this animal gives its entire life to, basically, is to this book, right?
Yeah.
So
it'd be a good one.
Yeah. So there's a tremendous amount of time that goes into actually getting to the point where you can write something down, but then there's a tremendous amount of lost economic opportunity that goes into making something so you can write. So you've gone through all this process. It's very costly. It's very time consuming. I heard an estimate once that, say, in the time of the Apostle Paul, to own a copy of one of his letters, let's say the Epistle to the Romans, which is his longest, would probably cost somewhere in the order of about $17,000 to $20,000 in modern money.
Wow.
So, not totally impossible, but also like to own a copy of a book, even a fairly short one like the Epistle to the Romans, represents a huge sacrifice, right? So I say all of this to say, because I think sometimes we have this this impression. Now it's a little better. I mean, in the East, where they still had this very high level of civilization, the Roman Empire did not fall in the East during the Middle Ages. So they had a high level of civilization. Paper and things like that, writing was more accessible. The literacy rates were significantly higher than they were in Western Europe. But East or West, books are expensive. And people have this idea that, oh, well, we're so much better educated now than they were then because our literacy rates are so much higher. And to rant maybe just a little bit, what I would actually argue is that our literacy rates are higher, but we're not better educated. That we're actually living in what I would consider to be a post-literate society. When somebody writes something down in the Middle Ages and somebody else picks it up to read, they really, really try hard to read it. And the harder it is, the harder they try. Because if somebody thought this was worth writing down, then it's important enough for me to give my time and my attention to, right? Nowadays, writing is so trivial. I mean, we have status updates, Twitter posts, etc. Tweets, they're called tweets. Hello, fellow kids. I know internet things. Yeah, so you have so now writing, text is so trivial to us. That's what I'm really trying to say. Text is so trivial to us that if we encounter something that's long and hard, what do? We eye skip and only read the first 1 to 2 sentences of each paragraph. And the sad thing is that our writing is so insubstantial now. It's so like empty. It's like, like devoid of calories or something, like that. Our writing is so empty now that actually you can really get away most of the time just eye skipping the first 2 or 3 sentences, because most people's writing can't carry or communicate a complex thought. Like every language has its own particular genius. The genius of Greek is in these really long, complex sentences. The genius of English has always been in its ability for brevity. You have even Old English poetry is this way. It's to have like these short, punchy half lines that have this whole world of implicature, this whole world of implied meaning and whatnot in them. But even that said, people were able to just hold a complex thought for a lot longer when writing took longer. So even somebody like C.S. Lewis, I mean, if you go read Lewis's letters, which I really recommend to really anyone who is interested in these things, because Lewis has a lot to say about the Middle Ages, but he's also a modern person living in a modern age, but still living, a life of the mind, a life of the letters, has a very active spiritual life. But Lewis wrote everything he wrote with a dip pen, so which is still like pretty old fashioned for his time. So with a dip pen, if I don't know if you've ever seen one, it's like you have a little pot or a little ink well, and then you have a pen that looks like, so this is a fountain pen that I use, so it's got a nib like a fountain pen, but there's no ink inside the pen. So you're dipping it in the inkwell, and you write 2 or 3 words, and then you dip again. So think about how much more slowly you'd write. So when you read Lewis's letters, and there's a really wonderful collection of letters by him, which I can't remember the name of now, but it was this Italian priest who had written to Lewis, but because he wanted to talk to him about some things, but the priest didn't really know any English, and Lewis didn't know any Italian, but they both knew Latin. So this is in the 20th century still. First half of the 20th century, people still knew Latin in school. And so this priest and Lewis had a whole series of letters, a whole series of communications in Latin as a living language. It's a really beautiful thing. So you can buy a collection of these letters along with an English translation. But if you're into Latin, and all right-thinking people should be into Latin. But if you're into Latin and you want to see what it would look like and their Latin's not perfect. Lewis's Latin is not perfect, but he's able to communicate and make himself understood in it. But anyway, all that to say, if you're writing with a dip pen, which is how everyone is writing in the Middle Ages, you're writing more slowly, right? And in the way it works on parchment is you sort of like scratch the letter with one side of the pen, and then you sort of turn the pen and allow the ink to actually fill in that scratch that you've made into the parchment, right? So it's a very slow, meticulous way of writing. And I think that when you're writing at this pace, you're able to form much more complex thoughts, sentences,
Right.
ideas.
Right.
It just lends itself to it better. I mean, if you want proof of this, spend a day writing and just try to write everything out longhand with a pen, or with a fountain pen or something like this, and still it's so much slower than typing that and then like look at that and then compare 1,000 typed words, and what you're going to find is the way that you formed your sentences, the way that you formed your thoughts really is different, because you had time for 20 thoughts in the course of writing that sentence, as opposed to one thought per sentence, which is how most of us write.
Right. The thought has more time to gestate while you're like in between words.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
As you write the first word, you have 20 thoughts before you get to the next one. Is going to be more complex, or thicker might not be the right word, but it might be.
It's gonna you could say it's gonna have higher. So I work in data sciences and information theory, things like this for my day job, right? So it's gonna have a higher it's gonna have a higher information density, right? You're gonna have a higher you could say there are, to put this in computer terms, right? A tweet is like they used to be 144 characters. I think they upped that at some point, but a tweet is like it's like a 16 kilobyte. It's a 16 kilobyte thought, and then a sentence from St. Maximus Confessor is like 2.5 gigabytes. It's just way more data. It's way more, but not just data. Like, we always think of data as being this really abstract thing, and it's not actually, but data is about storytelling, but that's a different podcast. It's but there's just much greater information density. Yeah.
Right. So information's the story that'll stick.
Yeah.
And then so what do you think about Twitter? Could they fix Twitter's information density by putting slow mode on the character input? If you put a couple of seconds at the very least between each character, would that increase the information density?
That is a fun idea. I don't think that would work.
Or if you had to tap the mouse pad, so it was like an ink, like it's as if you were dipping in inkwell.
I love this idea. I love like the idea of like what would really up the information density would be if people had to make the parchment for their tweets, and then like actually invest some serious, I mean, Twitter's such a throwaway kind of a thing. I think that would be a fun experiment, actually. I think my initial answer was just to say, no, I don't really think that would fix it, because people are a little too, like, we're already so vapid and used to being engaging and even like when we conduct our arguments, doing it in these really trivial ways. But actually, I think this would be a fascinating social experiment for somebody if you wanted to say, get 100 people and say, use Twitter for a month, and then say, now use my special Twitter app that has a a time delay between each word, you know, and so you've got more time to think about more time to think about your sentences as you write them. And first of all, like, and then do that for a month, and then say, first of all, do you tweet less? My guess would be, yeah, you probably tweet less. But then secondly, what's the information density of those tweets? I don't know. This would be a fun experiment. Somebody out there, if you're a weird combination of like a social scientist and an API programmer, I'm sure such people exist. Try this and let us know. Phone in and let us know how that works out for you.
Yeah, and I'm sure they're all watching my podcast, the entire
I know.
population.
Definitely. All right, so you wanted to talk about, and I know I went off maybe a little off script there, but yeah, good. So I know you wanted to talk about medieval literature and kind of how these stories endure into our own day and our own time. So, so where do you want to go with that?
Yeah, so I think for me, like, Chaucer seemed like a good pin. And I don't know if you could maybe like take what you know and kind of like project like into the future a little bit with like well, him, and maybe you could think about like his influences and maybe what they like the effect they had on like literature at his time, or just basically like the I guess there was a reason why people who like wrote great books and just write great books are remembered, and sometimes like it's hard to remember why someone in literature would be remembered, because they're not, you know, it's not Elon Musk or something. It's I was gonna say it's not romantic, but I think the problem is that, like, it is romantic, and what's the point of being like of like these romantic ideas? I don't know if you'd call them that. Like,
do you mean like why would something that doesn't seem to have like an obvious utilitarian purpose,
right?
Why is that something that continues to endure?
Yes, and why is it? Why is it part of culture? And I guess do you think there's a part of literature that's kind of been delegated to like the higher stratuses of culture, and that might just be, you know, literacy is more common as you go up the social stratus, but yeah, go ahead.
Okay, so complicated multi-part answer here. Okay, there are primary and secondary causes for which stories endure. I will give you an example. I'll go back, like I said before we started recording, I do love Chaucer, but Chaucer is actually like at the end of the period of literature I'm interested in. So anything like Tolkien, who I love, obviously I have there's a podcast and stuff. Tolkien so Tolkien really felt like we should end the syllabus at Shakespeare. And this is obviously because he was a bleeding heart liberal. We should end the syllabus at Chaucer, obviously. But to use the example of Beowulf, because I think Beowulf is a really interesting snapshot of how a medieval story survives. So we have zero indication of how popular Beowulf was in the Middle Ages. Just because of the various accidents of history. We know that Beowulf was written, and by the way, this is a very controversial thing, which I'm about to say. There have been actual fistfights at actual conferences over the dating of Beowulf. Very famous fistfights, actually. Yeah, but I'll say, and I would say Tolkien would agree with this, and actually most of the more recent scholarship also kind of agrees with this now. Beowulf was probably written sometime, let's say, in the 700s, in what we sometimes call the Age of Bede, which is like this golden age of flourishing Anglo-Saxon culture, before the Vikings show up and kind of things get bad for a little while.
Okay. When was that?
Sorry, say it again.
When was that?
So Bede lived in the let's say he died in 735, I think. Okay. So this would be in the latter half of the 7th century or first part of the 8th century. So like if I was going to date Beowulf to like a weird and totally unprovable level of specificity, I would guess sometime in the 720s. Like that would be that's my personal opinion. There's also I mean, basically, Beowulf scholars started out by thinking it was kind of an early work like this, in the early 8th century, and then there is then there was this huge push to say that actually it's a much later work, like maybe 9th or 10th century. That's what the fistfights were over, and now scholarship, because of some metrical evidence, basically the way that the meter of the poem is formed, now seems to actually favor the older date again. So that's kind of like the pendulum swinging back and forth. But anyway, I'm definitely an older date kind of person when it comes to Beowulf. So all this to say, there was a whole lot of Vikings showed up in England pretty shortly after this period. So various accidents of history, we have, a lot of monasteries got looted and things like this. So we don't actually know. We only have one surviving copy of Beowulf. We do know that this copy is a copy. It's not an original. There's no original manuscript of Beowulf that exists. We know that the copy we have is a copy. It's probably a copy into a different dialect of Old English. It's probably originally written in something like Mercian, and then it was when it was copied into another dialect called West Saxon, probably around the turn of the millennium. So we have a copy that's probably much later than the original. So that implies it was copied at least once, probably more than once. Okay, but we don't know how many times it was copied, and we only have one surviving copy. Normally, like the number of surviving copies you have of a manuscript can tell you something about how popular it is. So, for instance, there are certain Christian texts like the Ladder of Divine Ascent, which is a really important ascetical work in the Eastern tradition, also very popular in Western Europe at a certain point. There are literally thousands and thousands of manuscripts of that work that survive. So it's very easy to see that, oh, this is a really popular work, and actually continues to be really important in Eastern Christianity to this day. So, but we only have one surviving manuscript of Beowulf. So all that boring manuscript is talk to say we don't know how popular it was. There's some arguments you can make that the author of this other work seems to have read Beowulf, and so he's like using some lines from Beowulf or making allusion to Beowulf, something like this. But it's very inconclusive. So we don't know how popular the work was, and the work itself was in fact totally forgotten at the end of the Middle Ages. So it sat in this guy's library. This guy who's just sort of an antiquarian. He just went around buying up old manuscripts, and then he would put them on. He would put the manuscripts in his library, and the way that he organized his library was he would have busts of different Roman emperors on the different sections of his library. So the manuscript that the Beowulf poem is contained in, which also contains several other works, which are all monster stories, by the way. So it was like an anthology. It was like you could say like a 10th century Anglo-Saxon anthology of monster stories. So, which does indicate that this is something that people were interested in reading.
Right.
So the manuscript it's in is called the Cotton Verelius. I forget the number now, but Verelius being the Cotton was the name of the guy who collected it. Verelius is the particular emperor whose bust was on that shelf. So like this very, you could say, very kind of eccentric antiquarian collector and stuff. And then eventually during the time of another time of like revolt and revolution in England, the manuscript ends up getting stored in a place called the Ashburnham House. Now, just pro tip, if you're going to store a bunch of ancient manuscripts in a building, that building should not be named the Ashburnham House.
Yes, do not call it that.
Yeah. So there was in fact a fire. And the manuscript was damaged in the fire, and it was only saved because somebody essentially chucked it out a window. And so the whole, so it's just sort of like a series of accidents or providence or whatever you want to call it, that the Beowulf manuscript even survived for us to read. And in fact, the only reason that we know what was on those damaged pages is that, not too long before the fire, somebody actually made a transcript of it. And the reason that guy made a transcript of it, he was working for the King of Denmark, and the King of Denmark had sent this guy over, who I think was an Icelander. It's been a while since I read about this. The reason they sent him over to England to basically dig through all these archives and all these old libraries, looking for. So at this particular time, people had started looking for, kind of like looking for the national epic, right? The story. Everybody wanted like equivalent like of Homer or the Iliad, the Odyssey, etc. So he sent him over initially, and the guy that found the manuscript couldn't read Old English. And it's actually in some respects better that he couldn't read Old English, because he ended up just copying it down letter for letter, as opposed to like trying to like fix it or tinker with it, whatever. He couldn't read Old English, but he read Icelandic, was a related language, and he saw a few words at the beginning, and he said, "Oh, this book is a history of the kings of Denmark," which is not really what the story is. But he just sort of like put that down in like a little thing. So a long time later, when European nationalism is kind of on the rise before it took some really bad directions, the Danes are like the Danes and the Germans are both looking for the big German national epic, the big Danish national epic and whatnot. And they see this guy's entry in one of his books, in basically a catalog that says, "Oh, over in England, there's this manuscript that is of the Danish kings." And so they send people over to look at it. And essentially what ends up happening is that they realize, oh, well, it's not a history of the Danish king, actually this epic poem kind of a thing. There are monsters, there's a hero, etc. And so the Danes were like, aha, there are Danes in this, so this is a Danish national epic. And the Germans like, well, it's written in English, which is a West Germanic language, so this is actually a German national epic. And then eventually, basically, it wasn't until the generation of scholars immediately preceding Tolkien, so like his professors, that the English said, actually, you guys, this is written in English. This is our story, and it's not quite a national epic. It's something more than that, or something different from that, you could say. So anyway, all that to say, Beowulf actually eventually becomes a part of the English syllabus, in large part due to Tolkien, and people still in American high schools today, depends on the school now, unfortunately, but in many schools, even now, I have a friend who's she teaches 9th and 10th grade English, and she's about to spend 3 weeks in the Beowulf poem with her students, obviously in translation, but it's become sort of a part of the syllabus, which I think is wonderful. I think Beowulf is the most beautiful thing that's ever been composed in the English language. People out there can fight me over that, but I really love it. So you have I think the Divine Comedy is probably the greatest poem ever written, but as far as English, as far as things go, written and composed in the English language, which is my language, I think Beowulf is the best. And so you've got like a series of historical accidents that actually allowed this particular text to be preserved. But
Right.
but the reason that it's popular now, and the reason that people love it now, and the reason that, you know, like people want to like retell it, and sometimes in terrible ways, Neil Gaiman. The reason that people want to retell it now is because there's something in it that goes beyond those historical accidents. And this is the thing I was trying to get to, is that there are a series of historical happenings that, and when I say accidents, I mean like the Aristotelian, the definition of that word. So like, let's say like the appearances of a thing, the you know, we're talking about history. I don't mean these things are accidental in the sense that someone did not intend them to happen, or God did not intend them to happen, or something like that. But just there's a series of historical happenings that bring about the preservation of a particular manuscript. But then the fact that that manuscript continues to resonate is it indicates that there's something about it, about that story, that goes beyond the particular time and the particular place at which it was written, right? It's got some kind of ability to transcend the things that were going on at the time that it was written. And this is what I think defines. So you asked a moment ago about, you didn't say this directly, but I think the sort of implied takeaway was, for me, was you were asking a little bit about like highbrow literature and lowbrow literature, right? Something like that.
Yeah.
So highbrow literature is lowbrow literature from a long time ago. That's, you know, that's you see what I'm saying?
That's a good way of thinking about it.
Yeah, so
right.
even something like the Divine Comedy. Dante, by choosing to write an epic poem in the vernacular language, choosing to write an epic poem in Italian instead of in Latin, which was the highbrow language of his time, Dante knew he had to sort of like defend the fact that that was even a thing he was doing. Like vernacular poetry was controversial, it was avant-garde, it was whatever, right? And so the justification that he found for that was the great Latin epic, the Aeneid, because in Virgil's time, all the great poetry is written in Greek. So if you're going to write an epic poem in Latin, which was the vernacular, it wasn't like high-end language, that was just like the common tongue in Virgil's day. That again, it was the sort of thing you had to justify a little bit. You know, it was kind of so. But then what Virgil did is, you know, not just Virgil, there are other poets too, but Virgil's sort of like the preeminent one as far as Dante is concerned, is that he elevates Latin to being this language of poetry and art, which before had been Greek, right? So then what Dante does is he elevates Italian to being this language of poetry and art, right? Which is part of what's kicking off in the Renaissance, right? But the Divine Comedy, I mean, it's a little difficult because like highbrow and lowbrow weren't quite the same back then as they are now. But many of the things, I won't say all of the things, but many of the things we would sort of consider highbrow literature now were things that common, ordinary people enjoyed when they were first written. Jane Austen, right? You know, which are great. I really think Jane Austen is great literature. She has some wonderful insights into human nature, into society, into like, why do we do the things that we do and say the things that we say? I think you can learn a lot of these things from Austen. But I don't think, I could be wrong about this, but I don't think that Austen was like really considered, she's considered highbrow now because her books are hard for a lot of us who are not used to reading older literature. But she wasn't considered a highbrow in her day, you know?
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
So I think that distinction is a little bit artificial. Now, this is where you get into something Tolkien was fighting against in his day.
Okay.
Go ahead. I'm just going to wander if you don't stop me.
I think that Austen, like most of the people who I find are interested in Austen, do have like a touch of that. I wouldn't even call it like lowbrow. I guess some would, but like I just find their grittier, like, and grittier isn't associated with smarts necessarily, but maybe, but like they're better people, and I guess like you can't really consolidate all the better people into lowbrow or
right. Definitely not.
yeah. But I think they get both, I guess. Like that's something cool about Jane Austen is you have both.
Yeah. I mean, I think her stuff continues to have a pretty broad appeal. Unfortunately, as our literacy actually drops, it's sometimes harder for people to read her stuff. It shouldn't be. I don't think Jane Austen, it should be particularly hard. But we're just not made to read as much, and our reading standards have really. The only way to become a good reader is to consistently try to read things that are a little bit too hard for you. It's just like lifting weights. So unfortunately, the approach that's been taken with children's literature is to give them things that are a little bit too easy for them, so that they will read more of them. And that's I think that's the wrong approach. But in any case, so when you're talking about highbrow, lowbrow, something that Tolkien kind of bumped into, and that we're still sort of dealing with it, though, for the moment, it seems that one could say the nerds have won. So one of the things that Tolkien bumped up against is that in Tolkien's time, and this was sort of, culture was still very hungover from the Victorian period, during which fairy tales and fantasy was considered to be basically the province of children. There was no reason adults should read or be interested in these kinds of stories, right? So that's going on in Tolkien's, so that people are still thinking that way in Tolkien's time. And so one of the things that Tolkien and Lewis are both having to do is sort of justify, why would I, as an adult and a serious academic, why would I be interested in writing, composing this kind of story, right? So so you sometimes still run into the distinction where people will be like, and already Lord of the Rings is making that movement from like this is like lowbrow literature and nerd culture stuff to now it's like it's slowly making that climb to being like highbrow literature, and like you get people complaining about how hard it is to read, and et cetera. So it's already, you can actually sort of see that happening in our lifetime a little bit, as simultaneously academia takes it more seriously, and then younger readers are coming in and being like, oh, well, this is long and boring, and what I really like is this thing over here, or Game of Thrones is great, or whatever, right? I think that Tolkien, I mean, you can't really say something's going to be a classic until it's survived at least a few hundred years. But I think that Tolkien, I think in 100 years, people will definitely still be reading Lord of the Rings. I don't think they'll be reading Game of Thrones in 100 years.
Yeah.
I think there's just, not that Martin's not a good writer. I have a lot of other problems with Game of Thrones. Martin is a good writer, but there's something about his view of the world, which is deeply nihilistic. It doesn't offer us the same kind of profound hope that we get in the Lord of the Rings.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm wondering, maybe nihilistically towards Martin himself. I wonder if I heard he has a less than Stephen King level work ethic. Like he has sort of like taken forever to write a book, and maybe he's sitting there with the Petersonian Cheeto dust game going. But
yeah, I don't know anything about his personal life. Yeah, I don't know, but yeah. So all this to say, like the highbrow lowbrow question now. So we're in this interesting moment. So one of the things that I actually love and almost never talk about in any of these podcasts is I really love superhero stories. I actually write and publish superhero stories, but also like I'm interested in phenomena from a perspective of superheroes sort of functioning as like it's really the only thing that seems to be filling a sort of universal mythological space in our culture now. And they're definitely a kind of American mythology, right? You have all of the, you think about Captain America, Superman, Batman, Iron Man, Wonder Woman, like all these different characters fill these sort of different mythological niches within the American experience. For instance, Iron Man is really like kind of this embodiment of the myth of progress, right?
Right.
Progress, scientific progress, but also progress paired with the mythological image of like the Elon Musk type billionaire tech wizard, right? That that these forward thinking Howard Hughes, et cetera, like these really forward thinking technological geniuses who have mastered the natural world, and they're going to lead us into whatever this next moment is going to be. But also we have a bunch of fears about that, which is why almost every Marvel movie is like Iron Man screws something up. He has this idea, this is going to save the world, but actually then he creates this monster that tries to take over the world, right? We're expressing like a lot of our cultural anxiety, our hopes and our anxieties right now in these stories.
Do you think that started with Frankenstein, like that idea, or Prometheus?
Yeah.
Would that?
Well,
Okay.
Yes. Short answer, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Frankenstein, I think, is a really important story if you want to understand a lot of what's going on right now, and the way that we think about it. Yeah, very important story. The book, not any of the movies. Most of the movies that have been made about it have been, very far afield as far as their focus and what they're about. But yeah.
Okay.
So,
okay.
Yeah. So all that to say, I just wanted to. I didn't. We're probably running out of time here, and I don't know if we've really talked about what you wanted to talk about, but I do think that superhero stories they're just a really interesting, and of course there are good ones and bad ones, and even within superhero stories, there's like your highbrow and your lowbrow, right? There's like your just like sort of goofy stories, and then there's stories that are maybe even a little too self-aware, like your Alan Moore stuff and some of Morrison stuff, where it's almost like and you get kind of over the hump there into like the whole deconstructionist, right? So we're deconstructing a genre that's only 50 years old. So anyway, all that to say, I think that the highbrow lowbrow thing can be a little misleading sometimes. But what makes a story endure? Why do we care about preserving one of these medieval texts? It's, at the end of the day, it's because I think there's something in it that's transcendent. That's the easiest way to say it. There's something in it that a good story, no matter when it's written, a good story manifests a pattern which many people are able to recognize as true, and which resolves the tensions of that pattern in a way that is satisfying and convincing. And when we encounter something like that, when we encounter that kind of a story, we tend to hold on to it.
Okay. And so do you think that okay, so I was gonna ask, what did you think about the ending of Game of Thrones? But I think I
haven't seen it and don't know.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's probably That's probably.
I do know that there's a lot of dissatisfaction out there about it, and that's why the interesting thing about Game of Thrones is that people are already sort of forgetting about it. So now people talk about, well, what's the next Game of Thrones going to be, right? And by the next Game of Thrones, what they mean is they want another medieval fantasy historical piece that's going to give them a high level of titillation, right? And so one of the interesting cultural phenomenon has been that all the shows that promise to be sort of the next Game of Thrones, each one of them is just like a little bit less good, as it progresses. Yeah. And so so I think it's one of those things, like it was an interesting cultural moment. I think it's over. As far as like I said, will people be reading it in 100 years? I don't think it's very likely.
Sure. So do you think that maybe there's something like I don't know, like you talked about the growth in the medieval ages, the growth towards I don't know, the church afterwards, or like the numinosity of the retaining that numinosity, or that mystery. Do you think that well, just like there's a I don't, like the tradition of Tolkien is building up to something, or do you think there's
too early,
something on the horizon?
it's too early to say. We'll know in another 500 years.
Okay.
I do think that Tolkien is a very important part of this sort of reawakening to because what some people have been calling reenchantment, right? But just this reawakening to magic in the world, a kind of a regaining of an ability to see the world symbolically. I think that one of your questions that you sent me, which I haven't gotten to, and I'm sorry for that, is you're asking about like when did the shift happen? Is it at Descartes, or is it whatever? It's probably earlier than Descartes, but Descartes is a convenient point for seeing like how far things have gotten. So what you have happening with Descartes is this idea that you're really just in your head, right? That I think, therefore I am. Like, you're really all just up in your head, and because you're all up in your head, the way that your body is, or the way that you embody that stuff in the world, like, doesn't matter so much anymore. And so what we're seeing is a return to an older perspective. You could sort of frame it as being like more phenomenological or whatever. A good example of this that I've used in a couple of the podcast interviews that I've done is that I know a couple of people who are astronomy professors, and they've actually gone back to teaching the old Ptolemaic model of astronomy to their undergrad students. And the reason that they do this is because they realized one day that the new crop of students coming in out of high school had no working knowledge of actual embodied astronomy. They couldn't go out to the front lawn and point up at the sky and say, that's Polaris, that's Orion, that's the Pleiades, etc. Like, they couldn't do that. And it was, so they knew all these facts about astronomy, and they knew all these concepts about gravity and all these different things, but they just had no embodied experience of that. And so what they started doing is saying, okay, we're going to begin with naked eye astronomy, and we're going to put you back. And they've actually, they actually built this really cool model, really cool teaching tool it's basically an astrolabe. Basically there's like a little meeple, like a little wooden man in the center of this model that's made out of wood. And then there are these dials on the bottom, and you move those dials so you set your guide facing a certain direction, and then you move those dials based on the time of year that it is, and the date and the month and whatever. And it will adjust the whole model to show you where every planet and every constellation is relative to where you are standing. And they're using this tool to teach high school kids and undergrad students how to do naked eye astronomy again, so that in the middle of the day, when it's bright outside like it is right now, I could say, hey, Shane, where is the constellation Orion right now? And you would know, even without being able to see it, he would know, well, Orion moves like this, right? And so right now it's there. It's like you could point like somewhere down and be like, right now it's there. When is Orion going to rise? Well, it's going to rise at this time of the night, right? So like so that's what they're teaching the students. And then once they master that, then they can move on to doing astronomy in a more abstract way. And so there is right now, I think, a push to, well, there's just a lot of crazy stuff happening right now. But one of the things that's happening right now is this push back towards a more embodied, more phenomenological perspective of experience of the world. And I think that Tolkien had a lot to do with that. What are the fruits going to be of that eventually? What are going to be the fruits of like the symbolic world stuff Jonathan Pageau is doing, and this whole sort of like network of podcasts around that, I don't know. It's too soon to say.
Yeah.
Ask me in 500 years.
I think it'll be, stay tuned for that one.
Yeah. We'll come back. We'll come back in 500 years to.
Yeah. But yeah, I don't know. It just seems like there's a beautiful like outgrowth. I almost think of like I've thought before, like the and it was just an image that came to my head once upon a time when I was talking to a buddy. It was like that the IDW kind of laid the soil, and then sort of like Pageau and that ilk kind of like grew up from that. It was like this this white flower that kind of came out of this dark soil. So
yeah,
Well, I don't know how much time you have.
I probably need to roll out. I it's getting close to the time of day when I would normally start work. So sorry if I wondered too much. But this is a good conversation though.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And feel free to reach out with, I don't know, any questions you have for me. Oh, do you want to plug
Sure.
I'm on Zoom?
So a few things that I'm doing out there. The first is that I am currently trying to collect and edit a book of essays on the sacramental imagination. So if you're interested in the things that I talk about here and elsewhere, and you'd like to contribute to that, I'm looking for people who are, you don't have to be an academic, just people who have thoughtful essays, or just an idea that you'd like to have a Zoom call with me and develop into a thoughtful essay. Reach out to me. You can go to findingthegoldenkey.com. There's a submission form there on the homepage. I'm the host of the Ammonsoul podcast, where we talk Tolkien and Orthodox Christianity with my good friend Father Andrew Stephen Damick.
Yes.
And I recommend people checking that out if you want to hear more thoughts about Tolkien and Old English literature. And then also I am doing right now a podcast series for the Symbolic World with Jonathan Pageau, where we're talking about the idea of medieval universal history, which is like, if you want to get like way more into the weeds than I did today about, medieval stories and why I think they still matter, check that out. So. Okay.
Yeah. And at some point I'd like to either message or discuss that podcast, because I haven't seen it. I'm sure I'll have like plenty of
you
thoughts.
Go listen to that, and we can just do a follow-up sometime. That'd be fun.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you so much, Richard, for coming on, and you guys all have a great day. Have a blessed day. And yeah. Thank you.
Thanks, Shane.
Thank you, sir. All right. Have a good day. Thanks. So we'll go. Okay. So Richard, what the name Lance isn't very common. But in the Middle Ages, they were called Lancelot. They were. All right, folks. That's it. You have a great day, Richard, and yeah.
After abuse like that, I don't know if I can come back, man. I was rough.
He's going. All right. Thank you, Richard.
Talk to you later. Bye.
All right. Have a good day.